Hi, I'm Tony Perez with Opticos Design. Thanks for joining us today. Today's session is about facade articulation standards, and while not a required element of every form-based code, there are situations when you want to apply these standards. Um, Welcome to the session. Look forward to having you join us. Thanks for joining us for today's session on facade articulation standards. And as you can see here on with these two examples on the screen, the one on the right has very detailed architecture, very historic architecture, beautiful. Uh, but what we're talking about today is not architecture, it's about the actual articulation of facades from, um, from big masses or even smaller masses of buildings and blank walls into walls and volumes that have openings and have interest. And most often that is left best to creativity by local designers. And sometimes it's a combination of that and historic patterns. So the example you see on the right is definitely a series of historic buildings with very historic architecture, but there are elements there that can be used in new buildings without necessarily using that architecture. So I just want to make it very clear what we're talking about here today is not architectural style, rather organization and composition of facades based on either existing elements that are desired by the community or elements that don't yet exist in the community that are desired to be included. The example on the left uh, is more than an architectural problem. You can see the beautiful one-story house on the left, the big porch at its entry, and then this two-story building, whether it's a two-unit, four-unit building, or a single-unit building. It doesn't have any facade articulation to speak of, or that even isn't is consistent with the patterns in that neighborhood. So simply, facade articulation standards are really trying to focus on the the bones of the building, if you will, the underlying composition that then can be detailed in any number of architectural styles. So again, this is all about the underlying composition of and organization of openings, um, windows, ground floor, the upper parts of buildings. That's what we're really talking about, and it's best when you look at the existing patterns in an area and take the cues from the prevalent patterns that are desired by the community and turn those into standards. So again, for those that aren't convinced, why is this important? This building satisfies, life safety, building, fire, all those codes, and actually has a nice finish of stucco on it and some nice entry doors, even a nice little canopy. And individually, the windows are pretty nice, but collectively, this is lacking because the proportion of the windows to the wall, the the lack of congruity with the adjacent facades that are very, very different and have a far different pattern. Uh, this building just doesn't contribute to that existing character. Actually, detracts from it. This building is actually very odd. It's a one-story low-rise building, to be sure. It has a very suburban pattern, even though it's in downtown. But the big problem here, in addition to the others, is the giant blank wall. And so there's nothing compelling these folks to change that. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed in these kinds of standards. Similarly, here, this building is very thought out. The designer of this spent a lot of time thinking about the glass block and the pattern that they were trying to create and whatever message they're trying to convey through that architecture. But it isn't consistent with the rest of the block or the area that this building is located in, and doesn't contribute to that character. And so it's very different. Its composition, it's breaking a lot of the patterns that are already in the area. Same here. This actually uh, has its sides, the building's sides, to the front of the street in most cases, and you can see some windows there on the right hand side. But most of the windows here are on what what you would call the sides of the buildings going away from the street, and that's just because of the design of the building, the design of the units, the way they're laid out. And so it's integral to unit and space design to think about the fronts and side streets of buildings that actually face the public realm and shape the public realms. As we've spoken earlier in other segments, all these things interrelate, and ultimately they either shape a great streetscape and public realm, or they don't. And so these facade articulation standards are just one more element in trying to ensure that public realm is not only shaped well and positively, but that the things that are shaping it, the walls of buildings, are actually contributing and continuing the character that is important in the community. So the way to do that, in our experience, is to keep it simple. And let me go through that here with these standards. The first piece of this approach is called tripartite facade design, and it's just basically saying there are three parts to a facade, and that's a base, a middle, and a top. And in this section of a code, if we had 45 minutes to an hour, we could actually break it all down and just talk about this for that length of time. But basically, what you're saying is uh, you need to express three parts of the building. And you can see here in this beautiful building at B and 4th in downtown San Rafael, um, there is a base on the building itself, the shop front that's actually stone. You can see that green stone there. That could be considered a base to that building, or you could consider the ground floor, which actually has a little intermediate band between the top of the ground floor and the bottom of the second floor window there. You can see there's a little intermediate band. That could be considered the ground, or the base, sorry. So in this diagram, that would be A. And then B is the body of the building, most of the building actually. And then C is any combination of a cornice and a pitched roof on the very top, or even sometimes the designer might take a one of the top floors and connect it visually through materials or through some kind of line here, um, and connect it to the cornice and the roof if there's an exposed pitched roof. So there are a lot of options for how to do this. It's just a very timeless practice of breaking up facades into three pieces. It's thousands of years old. It comes from classical roots of design, and we've just found it very effective in organizing facades. And so this is a simple intention that can be carried out in a number of ways. The next piece of this are options for how to organize a facade. And what we do in communities is look at historic buildings, look at new buildings, and see which patterns are prevalent and which patterns of those that are prevalent are contributing to that physical character that people find great about their community. And so you can see here there are several options for organizing the facade from left to right in a number of divisions, and those divisions can be asymmetrical or symmetrical, and depending on the number of divisions, you can then organize openings and windows and stories to work with those divisions. So again, there's an underlying pattern in great building design, and the idea is to have some of that influence new building design, but not to the extent of rigidity and basically having everything be a foregone conclusion. It's simply to organize a background, if you will, for the designer to then start combining or not combining elements but having this underlying organization that will then organize and structure the entire facade into something that has a pattern that that feels characteristic of everything else in town that people hold dear. The next step is massing and composition. And once you've organized your facade and you have an underlying approach to how you want to combine or not combine um, the divisions and the pattern that you identify, the next thing is to identify how the building is going to be massed. Is it going to be massed toward the front? Is it going to be massed toward the middle? And the zoning standards have a lot to say about that. But is still creativity and allowed in the standards. And so the designer then moves uh, to within those standards to design the facade and compose the actual openings and stories and how those are expressed. And then lastly, the openings and windows are applied to that composition. So depending on the composition that the designer has chosen, um, there are a number of techniques for how to apply windows and openings. And you might say, well, isn't a window an opening? Well, yes and no, but there are openings that aren't windows. So that's why we use the two terms. And you can see here that there are different types of windows, different ways to detail them, different ways to express them on the facade. And these standards are not talking about any of those details. They're simply talking about the proportions of the openings, that they're typically at least square, but most often vertically oriented. And whether they're really narrow or whether they're just vertically oriented, that's up to the designer and the design review process. This is simply asking for openings to be square, at least square or vertical, um, uh, to um, to be applied. And then you can also see that there's this technique called the mansard roof, which is a really wonderful technique, and you see it in a lot of older cities, especially in Europe. Beautiful Parisian streets have these mansard roofs, and they're another story, but they're inside the volume of the roof, and so you see the pitch slope of the roof with the dormers expressed away from that pitched roof, lining up with the facade below. And the mansard roof has really got a unfortunate reputation in the United States because of a lot of uh, strip commercial and fast food architecture that just misused this really beautiful approach. And so this is another part of windows and opening standards that we apply, encouraging designers to take advantage of this and to give the city, especially in the downtowns where there are bigger buildings, to give that roof line and that or that of each building and the skyline a little more interest, other than just parapet buildings, which are fine, but anyway, for variety. So all these standards work together to result in buildings that have this base, middle, and top organization, have a composition that is inherent or intrinsic of the character in the area, and then have openings that reflect that as well and can vary in architectural style and detail. And then lastly, for buildings that choose to have a corner element, or let's say that the plan and the code required certain corner elements at certain locations, um, then these kinds of elements come into play. And you've seen these all over the Bay Area. There are many um, wonderful examples of this. And so the two on the right you can see are simple, and they're single story corner elements beginning at the second floor. Some people call those an upper story bay window, others call them an oriel. But at any rate, they are wonderful little expressions of visual interest at these corners that make the corner memorable and make the building memorable as well. And then this other one here on the left, it's actually a three-story corner element. Um, so there are different ways to do this, and the standards allow all of these, unless for some reason there's a reason not to. There's also a version that comes down all the way to the ground and expresses the corner element down to the sidewalk. These all happen to be beginning at the second floor. So the combination of all these elements that I've shown you today um, are part of the facade articulation standards that aim to do more than just break up the facade, but to start to organize it and express it in ways that the community would find familiar and inviting and welcoming, that they would say that is a facade that feels like it's part of our community as opposed to some other place. So again, it's a very fine line between uh, telling people how to design each and every building, which is not the intent of these codes, and that's not how they're detailed. But that's a big misunderstanding, unfortunately, because I think a lot of codes in the early days, 20 years ago or so, actually did that because the developers and the architects of those projects wanted that very particular result. But the kinds of codes that we're talking about today simply set up the elements and the requirements for those elements to be organized, but leave enough flexibility for the designer to still have something to do and to be creative. So thank you. Thank you for your time today. Um, Thank you for uh, listening to this, and I look forward to your questions and your discussion with you. Thank you again for your time.